She lost everything at 60. The unbelievable journey of Reba Mcentire after being abandoned when she least expected it. The golden October sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling Nashville mansion, casting warm shadows across the marble floors that had witnessed countless celebrations, industry meetings, and intimate family moments. Reba Mcentire stood in her luxurious kitchen, stirring her morning coffee with the same silver spoon she had used for the past 15 years, a wedding gift from Narvel that had become as much a part of her daily ritual as the sunrise itself. At 60 years old, she moved with the grace of a woman who had commanded stages for over 4 decades, her trademark red hair now a more sophisticated auburn, framing a face that still held the spark that had captivated millions of country music fans worldwide. The house hummed with its usual morning energy. Narvel Blackstock, her husband of 26 years and the mastermind behind her career's most successful chapter, was already on his 3rd phone call of the day, pacing in his home office while simultaneously reviewing contracts and booking details for Reba's upcoming tour. His voice carried the authoritative tone that had negotiated some of the biggest deals in country music, the same voice that had whispered sweet promises to her on their wedding night all those years ago. Through the open doorway, Reba could see him gesturing animatedly, his salt-and-pepper hair catching the morning light as he worked to cement another piece of their empire. This was the life they had built together, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of personal happiness and professional triumph. Reba Mcentire wasn't just a country music star, she was an institution. With over 75 million records sold worldwide, 41 studio albums, and enough awards to fill a small museum, she had earned her title as the undisputed Queen of Country. But more than the accolades, more than the wealth or fame, what filled her heart with the deepest satisfaction was the partnership she shared with Narvel. He wasn't just her husband, he was her business partner, her creative collaborator, and the steady hand that had guided her career through every triumph and challenge. The telephone rang, interrupting her peaceful morning reverie. It was probably another interview request or tour venue confirmation, the kind of call that reminded her how blessed she was to still be in such high demand at an age when many artists had long since faded into nostalgia acts. She had seen too many of her contemporaries struggling to maintain relevance, playing county fairs and casino lounges to audiences that remembered their glory days better than their current music. Not Reba. She was still selling out arenas, still topping charts, still setting the standard for what it meant to be a country music legend. Dear friends, if you're enjoying this story of one woman's incredible journey, we'd love to have you as part of our community. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on Reba's inspiring story as it unfolds. As she sipped her coffee, Reba reflected on the ambitious plans she and Narvel had been discussing for the coming year. There was talk of a new television project, not just another guest appearance, but a starring role that would showcase her acting abilities to a new generation. The music industry executives who had initially dismissed her sitcom Reba had been forced to eat their words when it ran for 6 successful seasons, proving that her appeal extended far beyond concert halls and recording studios. Now, at 60, she was ready to prove once again that age was just a number when you had talent, determination, and the right team behind you. The recording studio they had built in the mansion's East Wing had been buzzing with activity lately. Reba was working on what she believed could be her most personal album yet, a collection of songs that spoke to the experiences of women who had lived, loved, lost, and found themselves again. She had always been drawn to songs that told stories, narratives that connected with real people facing real challenges. This new project felt different, though. There was a depth to the material that came from decades of living, a wisdom that could only be earned through experience. Narvel appeared in the kitchen doorway, phone still pressed to his ear, but he caught her eye and smiled, that same smile that had first captured her attention when they met professionally all those years ago. He had been managing other artists then, building a reputation as someone who could take talented performers and transform them into superstars. When he turned his attention to her career, the results had been nothing short of miraculous. Under his guidance, she had evolved from a respected country singer to a multimedia empire, branching into television, endorsements, and business ventures that most artists never even considered. Their morning routine was a testament to how seamlessly they had blended their personal and professional lives. While Reba handled the creative aspects, choosing songs, working with musicians, perfecting her performances, Navel managed everything else. He negotiated contracts, planned tours, handled media relations, and made the countless decisions that kept her career running like a well-oiled machine. It was a partnership that had made them both wealthy and successful, but more importantly, it had allowed them to build a life together that was both personally fulfilling and professionally rewarding. The country music industry had changed dramatically since Reba first stepped onto the scene in the 1970s. The rise of digital music, streaming services, and social media had transformed how artists connected with their audiences. Many performers from her generation struggled to adapt to these new realities, but Reba had embraced change with characteristic enthusiasm. She understood that staying relevant meant more than just recording great music. It required constant evolution, constant growth, and the willingness to take risks even when conventional wisdom suggested playing it safe. As she moved through the house, Reba passed the wall of photographs that chronicled their journey together. There were pictures from award shows, behind-the-scenes shots from recording sessions, candid moments from family gatherings, and formal portraits that captured the evolution of their relationship, from business associates to husband and wife to the power couple they had become. Each image told a story of success built on mutual respect, shared vision, and unwavering support for each other's dreams. The guest bedroom on the second floor had been converted into what they jokingly called the trophy room, though it served a more practical purpose as Navel's secondary office when he needed to escape the chaos of tour planning and contract negotiations. The walls were lined with gold and platinum records, Country Music Association awards, Grammy nominations, and recognitions from organizations across the entertainment industry. But mixed among these professional accolades were more personal treasures. Thank you letters from fans whose lives had been touched by her music, photographs with fellow artists who had become lifelong friends, and mementos from performances that had held special meaning. Looking out the window toward the perfectly manicured gardens that surrounded their property, Reba felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had created together. The grounds were meticulously maintained, with seasonal flowers that provided color year-round, and walking paths that offered peaceful retreats from the demanding pace of their professional lives. This was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves away from the cameras and expectations that came with celebrity. The intercom system crackled to life, Navel's voice filling the kitchen with news about a potential collaboration with a younger country artist who was eager to work with her. These cross-generational partnerships had become increasingly important in recent years, providing opportunities for established artists like Reba to introduce their music to younger audiences while offering emerging performers the benefit of working with proven professionals. It was a strategy that had kept her name on the charts and her concerts filled with fans spanning multiple decades. But beneath all the professional success and personal happiness, Reba carried a quiet awareness that time was precious. At 60, she was defying the conventional expectations for women in the entertainment industry, but she also understood that every year brought new challenges, new competitors, and new pressures to prove that she still belonged at the top of her field. The music business had never been kind to aging female performers, and despite her track record of success, she knew that complacency could be career suicide. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her stylist, confirming details for an upcoming photo shoot that would be used to promote the new album. Even these routine professional interactions carried weight now. Every public appearance was an opportunity to demonstrate that she remained vital, relevant, and worthy of her legendary status. The pressure was subtle but constant, a reminder that in the entertainment industry, perception often mattered as much as talent. As morning turned to afternoon, Reba found herself humming one of the new songs she had been working on, a ballad about second chances and the courage required to start over when life takes unexpected turns. The melody had been haunting her for weeks, and the lyrics seemed to write themselves during quiet moments like these. She had no way of knowing that this song, born from artistic inspiration and creative exploration, would soon become the soundtrack to the most challenging chapter of her life. The mansion felt alive with possibility, filled with the energy that came from two people who truly understood and supported each other's dreams. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer, and the golden light began to fade. An ominous phone call was about to shatter this perfect world in ways that Reba Mcentire could never have imagined. The conversation that would change everything was just hours away, waiting like a storm on the horizon of what seemed like an endless clear sky. The evening air carried a crisp October chill as Reba settled into her favorite armchair in the living room, a steaming cup of chamomile tea warming her hands while she reviewed the lyrics for her upcoming recording session. The house had grown quiet, except for the distant sound of Narvel's voice on yet another business call, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their successful life together. She had learned long ago not to interrupt these conversations, understanding that each call was another brick in the foundation of their empire, another step toward securing their future in an industry that could be unforgivingly fickle. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its resonant tone echoing through rooms filled with memories of birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and impromptu gatherings with friends from the music industry. This was the golden hour of their day, when business calls typically wound down, and they could reconnect as husband and wife, rather than business partners. Reba had planned a quiet dinner for 2, complete with Narvel's favorite roast chicken and the wine they had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to require anything more special than being together. But something felt different tonight. There was a tension in Narvel's voice during his phone conversations, a strain that she had noticed building over the past several weeks, but had attributed to the stress of planning her most ambitious tour in years. The entertainment industry had become increasingly demanding, with longer tours, more complex contracts, and the constant pressure to adapt to new technologies and changing audience expectations. She assumed he was simply feeling the weight of managing her career during one of its most successful periods. When Narvel finally emerged from his office, his expression was unreadable, a poker face that Reba had seen him use during difficult business negotiations, but never in their personal interactions. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say, each step calculated and purposeful. The casual intimacy that typically characterized their evening reunions was replaced by a formal distance that immediately set Reba's nerves on edge. "We need to talk," he said, the 4 words landing in the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of unease that spread through every corner of their carefully constructed life. His voice carried none of the warmth she was accustomed to hearing, none of the affection that had sustained their relationship through decades of challenges and triumphs. Instead, there was a clinical detachment that spoke of decisions already made, conversations already concluded, and futures already determined without her input. Reba set down her teacup with trembling hands, her intuition screaming warnings that her rational mind wasn't ready to accept. In her 60 years of life, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's intentions, a skill that had served her well in an industry filled with false promises and hidden agendas. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the possibility that the person she trusted most in the world might be about to betray that trust in the most fundamental way possible. "I want a divorce," Narvel continued, his words delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss tour schedules and recording budgets. There was no emotion in his voice, no acknowledgement of the devastation these words would unleash, no recognition that he was dismantling 26 years of marriage with a single sentence. He stood in the doorway of their living room, like a stranger delivering unwelcome news, his body language suggesting he was already mentally distancing himself from the life they had built together. The world seemed to stop spinning. Reba felt as if she had been physically struck, the breath leaving her lungs in a rush that left her gasping for air. The room that had always felt like a sanctuary suddenly became a prison, the walls closing in as the magnitude of his words began to register. This wasn't a discussion or a negotiation, it was an announcement, a fait accompli delivered with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "This isn't something we're going to work through," he added, anticipating her questions before she could voice them. "I've already made my decision. The papers will be filed next week, and I think it's best if we handle this as quietly and professionally as possible." The word "professionally" stung more than any other part of his declaration. Even in the destruction of their marriage, he was thinking about public relations, damage control, and protecting the brand they had built together. Reba's mind raced through 1,000 questions, searching for explanations that might make sense of this incomprehensible moment. Was there another woman? Had she done something unforgivable? Were there financial problems she didn't know about? But looking at Narvel's face, she realized that none of these questions would be answered tonight. He had clearly spent considerable time planning this moment, preparing his exit strategy, with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to every other aspect of their professional lives. Why? The single word escaped her lips as barely more than a whisper, carrying with it decades of love, trust, and shared dreams now reduced to rubble. She searched his face for any sign of the man who had held her during her father's funeral, who had celebrated with her when she won her first Grammy, who had stood beside her through every triumph and setback of their remarkable journey together. "I need something different," he replied, his answer as vague and unsatisfying as it was devastating. "This isn't working for me anymore. I need to move on with my life." The pronouns he chose were telling, I and me and my, making it clear that whatever future he envisioned, it didn't include her. The woman who had trusted him with her heart, her career, and her financial security was being dismissed like an employee whose services were no longer required. The practical implications of his announcement began crashing over her like successive waves. Narvel wasn't just her husband, he was her manager, her business partner, and the architect of every major decision in her professional life. Their divorce wouldn't just end their marriage, it would dismantle the entire infrastructure that supported her career. The tour they had been planning, the recording contracts he had negotiated, the endorsement deals he had structured, everything would need to be renegotiated or potentially cancelled. "What about the tour?" she asked, her practical mind grappling with immediate concerns while her heart struggled to process the emotional devastation. "What about the recording contract? What about everything we've been working on?" The questions tumbled out in a rush, each one highlighting another aspect of her life that was about to be thrown into chaos. "I'll honor my professional commitments through the end of the year," Narvel replied, as if he were discussing the terms of a business contract rather than the dissolution of their life partnership. "After that, you'll need to make other arrangements. I'm sure you'll be fine. You're Reba Mcentire, you don't really need me to be successful." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. While Reba possessed the talent and charisma that had made her a star, Narvel had been the strategic mind behind her career's most successful phase. He had negotiated the deals, managed the relationships, and made the countless decisions that had elevated her from country music star to multimedia mogul. Without him, she would be starting over in an industry that had little patience for older performers, especially older female performers. The conversation continued for another hour, but it was less a discussion than a series of pronouncements from Narvel about how their separation would be handled. He had already consulted with lawyers, already developed a timeline for their public announcement, already considered the impact on their various business ventures. His thoroughness was impressive and terrifying in equal measure, clear evidence that this decision had been weeks or months in the making, while she remained completely oblivious to the storm gathering around her. As midnight approached, Narvel retreated to the guest bedroom, leaving Reba alone in the living room that no longer felt like home. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock that now seemed to be counting down the final hours of the life she had known. She sat in her chair until dawn, staring at the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece, wondering how she had missed the signs that her marriage was ending, wondering how she would rebuild a life that had been so completely intertwined with someone who no longer wanted to be part of it. The morning brought no relief, only the harsh reality of phone calls that needed to be made, explanations that needed to be given, and a future that needed to be reimagined from scratch. At 60 years old, Reba Mcentire was about to discover just how cruel the world could be to a woman whose personal and professional life had been built around a partnership that no longer existed. The Queen of Country was about to learn what it felt like to be disposable, and the lesson would nearly destroy her before it ultimately saved her. The first weeks following Narvel's announcement passed in a haze of legal meetings, whispered phone conversations, and the surreal experience of pretending everything was normal while her world crumbled behind closed doors. Reba found herself moving through each day like an actress, playing a role she had never auditioned for. The abandoned wife trying to maintain dignity while her husband systematically dismantled their shared empire. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had spent decades singing about heartbreak and resilience was now living the very stories she had made famous. The Nashville music industry operated on a complex web of relationships, secrets, and carefully managed reputations. News of the divorce had been kept strictly confidential, but Reba could sense the subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Phone calls that used to be returned immediately now took days to be answered. Meeting requests that would have been enthusiastically accepted were suddenly met with scheduling conflicts and polite deferrals. The entertainment industry had an almost supernatural ability to detect weakness, and even without official confirmation, the Whisper network was already spreading rumors about trouble in paradise. Sitting in her lawyer's office on a grey November morning, Reba listened as Jonathan Matthews, her attorney for the past 15 years, explained the complex financial implications of her divorce. The numbers were staggering, not just the amount of money involved, but the intricate ways that her personal and professional assets had become intertwined over decades of marriage and business partnership. Properties, investments, recording contracts, publishing rights and endorsement deals would all need to be untangled and redistributed. "The challenge we're facing," Jonathan explained with the gentle directness that had made him one of Nashville's most respected entertainment lawyers, "is that Narvel has been your business manager for so long that separating your professional interests from your personal ones is going to be extremely complicated. Most of your major contracts have his signature on them as your representative." The weight of her dependence on Narvel became clearer with each document Jonathan reviewed. For over 2 decades, she had focused on the creative aspects of her career while trusting him to handle everything else. It had seemed like the perfect division of labor. She made the music, he made the deals. But now that collaboration had become a liability, leaving her vulnerable and uninformed about crucial aspects of her own financial empire. "What are people saying?" Reba asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "In the industry, I mean. Do they know?" Jonathan hesitated, a pause that spoke volumes about the conversations happening in boardrooms and executive offices across Music Row. "There are rumors," he admitted. "Nothing official, but people are starting to ask questions. Some are wondering if this might be a good time to renegotiate certain contracts, particularly if they think your management situation is in flux." The vultures were already circling. In an industry that celebrated loyalty but practiced opportunism, Reba's perceived weakness was someone else's potential advantage. Record executives who had smiled at her across conference tables for years were now calculating whether her upcoming projects would be worth the investment if she couldn't deliver the same level of professional stability they had come to expect. That afternoon, Reba drove to the small cafe where she had arranged to meet Charlie Morrison, a music producer who had worked with her early in her career and remained one of her few truly honest friends in an industry filled with professional relationships masquerading as personal ones. Charlie had called that morning saying he needed to talk to her about something important, and his tone suggested this wasn't going to be a casual social visit. She found him sitting in a corner booth, his weathered face reflecting the kind of weariness that came from spending 40 years navigating the music business. Charlie had produced some of country music's biggest hits, but he had also witnessed the industry's capacity for cruelty, particularly toward artists who showed any sign of vulnerability. His reputation for straight talk had sometimes made him enemies, but it had also made him invaluable to performers who needed honest advice more than pleasant reassurances. "Reba," he said, standing to embrace her with the warmth of genuine friendship, "you look tired, honey. This whole situation with Narvel is taking its toll, isn't it?" So the news was already spreading beyond the inner circle of lawyers and business managers. Reba felt a mixture of relief and terror at having her secret acknowledged openly. "How did you know?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. "This is Nashville," Charlie replied with a wry smile. "Secrets have a shorter lifespan than radio singles, but more importantly, I know because I care about you, and I can see what this is doing to you. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Over the next hour, Charlie painted a brutally honest picture of how the industry was viewing her situation. Without Narvel's management, many executives were questioning whether she could maintain the same level of commercial success. Her age was already a factor that made some radio programmers hesitant to support her new releases, and now the uncertainty surrounding her professional future was giving them additional reasons to hedge their bets. "They're saying you're finished," Charlie said, his words hitting her like physical blows. "They think without Narvel you're just another aging country singer who had a good run but doesn't understand that times have changed." Some of the younger executives are already talking about focusing their attention on artists who represent the future of the genre. The conversation continued with Charlie, detailing specific comments he had heard at industry events, casual dismissals of her relevance that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The woman who had been treated as country music royalty was suddenly being discussed like a relic from a bygone era, someone whose best days were behind her and whose future contributions would be measured in nostalgia rather than innovation. But, as Charlie spoke, something unexpected began happening inside Reba. Instead of feeling defeated by his words, she felt a familiar fire beginning to burn in her chest, the same determination that had driven her from small-town Oklahoma to the pinnacle of country music success. The dismissive comments from industry executives weren't crushing her spirit. They were awakening something that had been dormant during the comfortable years of her marriage, something fierce and uncompromising that had been the real engine of her success long before Narvel entered her life. "You know what, Charlie?" she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "They can think whatever they want to think. I was successful before Narvel Blackstock, and I'll be successful after him. If they want to count me out because I'm 60 years old and going through a divorce, then they obviously don't know who they're dealing with." Charlie smiled, recognizing the spark in her eyes that had been missing during the early part of their conversation. "There's the Reba Mcentire I remember," he said. "The one who told every record executive in Nashville that they were wrong about what country music could be, and then proved it by selling millions of albums. But you're going to need more than attitude to make this work. You're going to need a plan." That evening, Reba sat in her home office, a room that had previously been Narvel's domain but was now hers by default, surrounded by contracts, financial statements, and business documents that she was determined to understand completely. For years, she had signed papers that Narvel placed in front of her, trusting his judgment about deals and negotiations. That trust had allowed her to focus on her artistry, but it had also made her dependent on someone whose loyalty she could no longer count on. The learning curve was steep and sometimes frustrating, but Reba approached it with the same methodical determination that had characterized every other challenge in her career. She called industry contacts to ask questions that revealed her lack of knowledge about basic business practices, enduring condescending explanations from people who seemed surprised that she didn't already know these details. Each conversation was a humbling reminder of how much she had relied on Narvel, but also a step toward the independence she would need to survive. As she worked late into the night, Reba began to see patterns in her contracts and business relationships that she had never noticed before. There were clauses that seemed unusually favorable to Narvel's management company, deals that gave him more control over her creative decisions than she had realized, and financial arrangements that would leave her more vulnerable than she had understood. The discoveries were painful, but also illuminating, revealing the extent to which her professional autonomy had been gradually eroded over years of seemingly beneficial partnerships. The most shocking revelation came when she discovered that several of her most valuable assets, including publishing rights to some of her biggest hits, had been structured in ways that gave Narvel significant ownership stakes. What she had thought were joint marital assets were actually business investments that primarily benefited him, leaving her with less financial security than she had assumed. The man she had trusted with her heart had also been systematically protecting his own interests at the expense of hers. But rather than devastating her, these discoveries strengthened Reba's resolve. She was beginning to understand that her perceived dependence on Narvel had been more illusion than reality. Yes, he had managed the business side of her career, but the talent, charisma, and work ethic that made her valuable to the industry were entirely her own. The relationships with fans who bought her albums and attended her concerts were based on her music and performances, not his management skills. By dawn, Reba had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She was going to take complete control of her career, learning everything she needed to know about the business side of the music industry and proving to everyone who doubted her that Reba Mcentire was far from finished. The woman who had been dismissed as a victim was about to become the architect of her own resurrection, and the entertainment industry was about to discover that they had seriously underestimated the Queen of Country. The first meeting of Reba's new life took place on a cold December morning in the sleek conference room of MCA Records, where she sat across from three executives who had been instrumental in her career's most successful years. But the dynamic had changed completely. Where once Narvel would have occupied the seat beside her, advocating for her interests and negotiating on her behalf, Reba now faced these powerful men alone, armed with nothing but her determination and a crash course in music industry business practices. Tom Richardson, the label's senior vice president, opened the meeting with the kind of patronizing smile that made Reba's jaw clench involuntarily. "Reba, we're all so sorry to hear about your personal situation," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "We want you to know that we're here to help you through this transition. Of course, we'll need to reassess some of our upcoming projects given the changed circumstances." The word reassess hung in the air like a threat. Reba had learned enough about industry speak to understand that this was code for reducing her budget, scaling back her promotional support, and potentially cancelling projects that had been greenlit when she was still considered a sure bet. These men saw her divorce not as a personal tragedy, but as a business opportunity to renegotiate terms that had previously favored her. "Gentlemen," Reba replied, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her, "I appreciate your concern, but my personal life has nothing to do with my ability to make music that connects with audiences. My last album went platinum, my tour dates are selling out, and my fan base is as loyal as ever. What exactly needs to be reassessed?" The three executives exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this level of pushback from a woman they had assumed would be grateful for any support they offered. Tom cleared his throat and pulled out a folder filled with market research data and radio programming statistics. "The reality is, Reba, that the country music landscape is changing rapidly. Younger demographics are driving sales, and radio programmers are looking for artists who can appeal to broader audiences. We need to consider whether your current trajectory aligns with where the market is heading." What they weren't saying directly was even more insulting than their coded language. At 60, going through a highly publicized divorce, Reba represented everything that country music was supposedly moving away from: older, traditional, and potentially out of touch with contemporary audiences. They were essentially telling her that her time had passed and they were doing her a favor by letting her down gently. But Reba had spent the past month studying industry trends, analyzing sales data, and understanding the mechanics of radio promotion with the intensity of a graduate student cramming for finals. She had discovered something that these executives either didn't know or were choosing to ignore. Her demographic was actually growing, not shrinking. Women over 40 were becoming an increasingly powerful consumer segment, and they were hungry for music that spoke to their experiences. "Have you looked at the streaming numbers for artists like Martina McBride and Trisha Yearwood?" Reba asked, pulling out her own folder of carefully researched data. "Women our age are consuming more music than ever before, and they're specifically seeking out content that reflects their life experiences. The market research you're showing me focuses on radio play, but that's becoming less relevant every year. The future is in direct connection with audiences through multiple platforms." The room fell silent as Reba laid out a comprehensive analysis of how country music consumption patterns were evolving, how social media was allowing artists to bypass traditional gatekeepers, and how her particular brand of authentic storytelling was perfectly positioned to capitalize on these trends. She had done her homework, and her presentation was more sophisticated than anything these executives had expected from a woman they assumed was simply a talented performer, dependent on others for business strategy. Mark Stevens, the youngest of the three executives, leaned forward with obvious interest. "These are compelling points, Reba, but implementing this kind of strategy requires significant investment and a management team that understands digital marketing, social media engagement, and multi-platform content creation. No offense, but do you have that kind of infrastructure in place?" It was a fair question and one that Reba had been wrestling with for weeks. Building a new team from scratch would be expensive and time-consuming, and there was no guarantee that she could replicate the success she had achieved under Narvel's guidance. But she had also realized something important during her late-night crash course in industry business practices. Many of the strategies that had made her successful were actually quite simple, and the mystique surrounding music industry management often served to obscure rather than illuminate effective practices. "I'm building that team as we speak," Reba replied with confidence that was only partially feigned, "and I'm planning to do something that might interest you. My next album is going to be completely autobiographical. Songs about resilience, reinvention, and the strength it takes to start over when life doesn't go according to plan. Based on my research, there are millions of women who would connect with that message. The proposal was audacious and risky. Autobiographical albums could either be incredibly powerful or embarrassingly self-indulgent, depending on the execution. But Reba had realized that her personal crisis might actually be her greatest professional asset. Instead of hiding from the divorce and pretending everything was fine, she could transform her pain into art that spoke to universal experiences of loss, betrayal, and recovery. Over the next hour, Reba outlined her vision for an album that would be raw, honest, and unflinchingly personal. She wanted to write and record songs about the shock of unexpected abandonment, the terror of starting over in middle age, and the gradual discovery of inner strength that most people never knew they possessed. It would be country music at its most fundamental level, storytelling that connected with real human experiences rather than manufactured emotions designed to appeal to focus groups. The executives were intrigued despite themselves. While they had expected to spend this meeting managing Reba's decline, they found themselves discussing the potential for what could be her most commercially and critically successful project in years. The combination of her legendary vocal ability, her newfound vulnerability, and the universal appeal of reinvention stories created a formula that could resonate far beyond traditional country music audiences. The marketing possibilities are enormous, Mark admitted, his business mind already calculating promotional strategies. This kind of authentic personal narrative is exactly what connects with audiences across multiple platforms. We could build an entire campaign around themes of empowerment and resilience, but Tom Richardson remained skeptical, representing the conservative faction within the label that preferred established formulas to innovative risks. The concept is interesting, he conceded, but we need to be realistic about the commercial prospects. Personal albums don't always translate to radio success, and without strong radio support, it's difficult to achieve the kind of sales numbers that justify major promotional investment. Reba had anticipated this objection and was ready with her response. Radio is just one piece of the puzzle, she said, pulling out charts that showed how successful artists were increasingly building careers through touring, merchandise, licensing deals, and direct fan engagement. I'm not asking you to bet everything on radio play. I'm asking you to bet on my ability to connect with audiences who are hungry for authentic music that speaks to their real lives. The meeting concluded with a tentative agreement to move forward with pre-production for the new album, though Reba could see that the executives remained uncertain about her long-term commercial viability. As she walked out of the building into the cold Nashville afternoon, she realized that this was just the first of many battles she would need to fight to rebuild her career on her own terms. But something had shifted during that conference room confrontation. For the first time since Narvel's devastating announcement, Reba felt like herself again, not the abandoned wife or the aging performer trying to hold on to past glory, but the fierce competitor who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated industry through sheer talent and determination. The executives had expected to manage her decline, but instead they had encountered a woman who was just beginning to discover her own power. That evening, Reba sat at her piano and began writing the first song for what would become her most personal album ever. The melody came easily, flowing from emotions that were too raw and real to be anything but authentic, as her fingers found the chords that would support lyrics about betrayal, abandonment, and the terrifying freedom that comes with losing everything you thought you needed. She realized that Narvel's departure had given her something unexpected, the motivation to become the artist she had always been capable of being. The industry executives who were already writing her obituary had no idea what was coming. The woman they saw as damaged goods was about to become more dangerous than she had ever been before, armed with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Reba Mcentire was preparing to remind Nashville exactly why she had earned the title Queen of Country, and this time she would be wearing the crown on her own terms. 18 months after that devastating October evening when her world collapsed, Reba Mcentire stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, holding a crystal trophy that reflected the spotlights like a prism of possibility. The Country Music Association had just named her album Phoenix Rising as the year's best, and the audience of her peers rose in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the historic venue's foundation. But this moment represented far more than professional recognition. It was vindication for every person who had been written off, dismissed, or told their time had passed. The album that industry executives had initially viewed with skepticism had become a cultural phenomenon that transcended traditional country music boundaries. Songs like Starting Over at 60 and Stronger Than Before had resonated with audiences across multiple demographics, generating millions of streams and inspiring countless women to share their own stories of resilience on social media. What began as Reba's personal journey through heartbreak had evolved into an anthem for anyone who had ever needed to rebuild their life from scratch. The commercial success was staggering. Phoenix Rising had debuted at #1 on both country and pop charts, achieved double platinum status within 6 months, and spawned 3 crossover hits that dominated adult contemporary radio. But beyond the impressive sales figures was something even more meaningful. The album had sparked a conversation about ageism, divorce recovery, and female empowerment that extended far beyond the entertainment industry. Standing at the podium to deliver her acceptance speech, Reba surveyed an audience that included many of the same executives who had questioned her viability just 2 years earlier. Tom Richardson sat in the third row, his earlier skepticism replaced by the calculated enthusiasm of someone eager to associate himself with unexpected success. The irony wasn't lost on her that the vulnerability these men had seen as weakness had actually become her greatest strength as an artist. "When I started working on this album," Reba began, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium, "I thought I was documenting the end of something. Instead, I discovered I was capturing the beginning of the most authentic chapter of my life. This award doesn't belong just to me. It belongs to every woman who has ever been told she was too old, too damaged, or too set in her ways to start over." The speech continued with Reba acknowledging the unexpected gifts that had emerged from her darkest period. The divorce that had initially seemed like a professional death sentence had freed her to make creative choices based on artistic integrity rather than commercial calculations. Without Narvel's input filtering her decisions, she had rediscovered the fearless instincts that had originally driven her success. But the most surprising revelation came in the final minutes of her speech. "I need to thank someone who probably isn't expecting it," Reba said, her voice taking on a tone that commanded absolute attention. "Narvel Blackstock, my ex-husband, gave me the greatest gift possible when he asked for our divorce. He freed me to discover who Reba Mcentire really was when she wasn't trying to be half of someone else's vision." The audience stirred with surprise at this unexpected acknowledgement. Rather than bitterness or recrimination, Reba was expressing genuine gratitude for what most people would consider the worst experience of her life. The gesture was both gracious and subtly powerful, demonstrating that she had moved so far beyond their failed relationship that she could view it with perspective and even appreciation. The transformation extended far beyond her recording career. In the months following the album's success, Reba had launched a multimedia empire that operated entirely under her control. A syndicated television show featuring conversations with women who had overcome major life challenges became one of daytime television's highest-rated programs. A line of clothing designed for women over 50 who refused to become invisible generated millions in revenue while making fashion statement about aging with style and confidence. Her touring operation had evolved from traditional concert presentations to immersive experiences that combined music with motivational speaking and community building. Venues sold out, not just because fans wanted to hear familiar songs, but because they craved connection with other people who understood the challenges of navigating life's unexpected detours. Each concert felt more like a celebration of collective resilience than a mere entertainment event. The business acumen that Reba had developed during her crash course in industry practices was now generating opportunities that extended far beyond music. Publishers competed to secure rights to her autobiography, television networks pitched reality shows and documentary projects, and corporations sought her endorsement for products targeting mature women who had been largely ignored by mainstream advertising. But perhaps the most unexpected development was entirely personal. During a charity event for tornado victims in Oklahoma, Reba had met Anthony Skeeter Lasuzzo, a retired Army colonel who had dedicated his post-military career to disaster relief coordination. Their initial conversation about organizing benefit concerts had evolved into a friendship that gradually deepened into something neither of them had been looking for. Skeeter was nothing like Narvel. Where her ex-husband had been calculating and image-conscious, Skeeter was straightforward and unpretentious. He had no interest in managing her career or reshaping her public persona. Instead, he offered something that had been missing from her life for years, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than professional convenience. Their romance unfolded with the careful consideration of two people who had lived long enough to understand the difference between passion and compatibility. Skeeter attended her concerts not as a business advisor, but as a genuinely supportive partner who celebrated her success without needing to claim credit for it. When paparazzi photographed them together at industry events, the images showed a woman who looked genuinely happy rather than professionally polished. The relationship became public during the Academy of Country Music Awards ceremony, where Reba had been nominated in 4 categories, including Entertainer of the Year, an honor that typically went to much younger performers. When her name was announced as the winner, breaking the gender and age barriers that had long dominated the category, Skeeter's proud smile in the audience told a story about love that had nothing to do with business strategies or career advancement. In her acceptance speech that night, Reba delivered what many considered the most powerful moment of her career. 3 years ago, I thought my life was ending, she said, holding the trophy that represented the pinnacle of country music achievement. I had been abandoned by someone I trusted, dismissed by an industry I had served faithfully, and written off by critics who thought a 60-year-old woman had nothing left to offer. Tonight, I'm standing here as proof that our greatest failures can become our most important foundations. The speech continued with Reba addressing the broader implications of her journey. If you're watching this and you think it's too late to change your life, if you believe that society has decided your value has expired, if you're convinced that your best days are behind you, I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. The most beautiful chapters of your story might be the ones you haven't written yet. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, with industry veterans and newcomers alike recognizing that they had witnessed something transcendent. This wasn't just an entertainer accepting an award, it was a cultural moment that redefined what was possible for women who refused to accept society's limitations. As the ceremony concluded, and Reba walked backstage surrounded by congratulations and interview requests, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once defined herself primarily in relation to others, as Narvel's wife, as a star managed by someone else's vision, had discovered that her greatest strength lay in her individual authenticity. The final validation came 6 months later, when Phoenix Rising was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, recognizing it as a recording of lasting cultural significance. But by then, Reba was already working on her next project, a Broadway musical based on her life story that would open with the devastating scene of Narvel's announcement and conclude with her triumph at the CMA Awards. The musical, tentatively titled Starting Over, represented the ultimate transformation of her personal pain into universal art. What had begun as the most humiliating experience of her life was becoming a source of inspiration for millions of people who needed to believe that reinvention was possible at any age. Standing in her newly renovated home office, a space that now reflected her own taste rather than compromises made for someone else's comfort, Reba looked at the wall of achievements that chronicled not just her career, but her evolution as a human being. The awards were impressive, but more meaningful were the thousands of letters from fans who had found courage in her story to leave unhappy marriages, start new careers, or simply refuse to accept that their dreams had expiration dates. At 63, Reba Mcentire had accomplished something that most people never achieve at any age. She had completely reinvented herself, not as an escape from who she was, but as a fuller expression of who she had always been beneath the roles others had assigned her. The Queen of Country had reclaimed her crown, but more importantly, she had discovered that true royalty came not from others' recognition, but from the courage to rule her own life with wisdom, authenticity, and uncompromising self-respect.